Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Australian Human Rights Commission's Kep Enderby Memorial Lecture. My name is Jeremy Fernandez. I'm a journalist and presenter with ABC News. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'll be your guide through today's event. The Kep Enderby Memorial Lecture is an annual public event held by the Australian Human Rights Commission to honour the memory of the Honourable Kep Enderby QC. As Attorney-General, Kep Enderby introduced to Parliament the bill which would become the Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. Each year, the Memorial Lecture advances public understanding and debate about racial discrimination, the Racial Discrimination Act, racism, and human rights. Today's event is in the format of a webinar. This means audience members will be muted and your cameras are turned off. Auslan interpretation is taking place on screen, and you can turn on the closed captions facility by clicking on the closed captions button on your viewer. In your emails reminding you of today's event, you will have also received a document with instructions on how to access closed captions. So if you're having a bit of trouble, check out that email. If you experience any technical difficulties, we recommend you leave the webinar and try to rejoin. A recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the Commission's YouTube channel in the next few days too. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Commission for being with us here today. And to begin, I'd like to invite Michael West, a cultural representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, to welcome us here today. Michael is a member of the Stolen Generations and is an Aboriginal man of the Gamilaroi Nation. Michael operates Gawali, a consultancy which focuses on social inclusion, diversity, reconciliation, and knowledge transference. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bojadi Gamarua, Gadigal, Bijigal, Eora. I'm Michael from Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, and we're the custodians of land, air, water, and culture within our boundaries. And the Human Rights Commission, being in Sydney CBD, there is within our boundaries and on our land. I'd like to say that it's very important about people's rights when you think about it around the world these days. We look around the world. Sorry, a train might be going by. I'm here in beautiful suburbia. Wait a second. Sorry about this. This is just about being out in the burbs, which is great. I love being out in the burbs and out with the community and everything. So yes, when you look around the world, rights are being wound back and under attack when you think about it. Not just human rights, human rights, but not just human rights, particularly for females, have been, the last few years have been attacked, one might say. Roe versus Wade, we've seen in Afghanistan, we've seen in other countries where people's rights aren't being respected. They're all human rights that need to be respected. And obviously, when you think about it, the last night, there was a special people of community coming together from all different walks of life to remember Cassius and what's happened over in Western Australia, which is terrible. And we always have to be vigilant in protecting rights. And we have to be honest about the conversations we need to have moving forward, about dates, about history, and specifically too about the racism that is out in community that Aboriginal people experience every day when you think about it. But there are a lot of people that are coming along with us and becoming allies, and I think there's a brighter future happening moving forward when you think about it. I'd like to, on behalf of all of us, acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders of the past, present and future. I'd like to acknowledge all our ancestors. I'd also like to acknowledge country, because our Mother Earth has been speaking to us that we are not respecting her. We will all become part of her one day, and she gives us everything we have around us. And at the Land Council, we also want everyone to make that connection to your community, and also please look after yourself with the self-care that you need to have, because we're going through very interesting and difficult times. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land never ceded. From Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, our elders and our board and our members, we welcome here today. And this is a very important issue that we are talking about today, but it's an ongoing issue that needs to be discussed every day. And we need to be vigilant in protecting people's rights. And look, everyone, the festive season is coming up. Sorry, I'm talking over train here. The festive season is coming up. So please do take the time out. Have an enjoyable festive season, everyone. And look, please take some time to reconnect with your family, connect with Mother Nature, listening to those birds, and taking your shoes off and connecting with the earth. We all need to do that. I will say Yalu in my language, and please have those serious conversations we need to have. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for that very warm and generous welcome. Much appreciated. Now, the Commission would like to recognise the strength, hope and courage of those who work tirelessly to undertake anti-racism work and build visions of what change might look like in the future. In particular, the Commission recognises First Nations communities that have been at the forefront of anti-racist action for hundreds of years on this land. The Commission's event partner today is the European Union delegation to Australia. For the last 40 years, the delegation to Australia has been actively strengthening bilateral ties between the EU and Australia. So I'd like to introduce the European Union Ambassador Designate to Australia, Mr. Gabriele Vicentin. Mr. Vicentin has been the EU Special Envoy for the Indo-Pacific since September of 2021. His focus is in publicising the main strands of the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific, creating consensus and paving the way for its implementation. In this role, Mr. Vicentin is also responsible for the preparatory works of the EU-US high-level consultations on the Indo-Pacific. Mr. Vicentin previously headed the European External Action Service Division, covering parliamentary and interinstitutional affairs. I'd like to invite the Ambassador Designate to welcome you to today's event.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to everybody who is viewing and listening to us today. So thanks for your kind introduction, maybe a bit too long as far as my CV is concerned, but thank you. And above all, thanks as well to the Australian Human Rights Commission and to Commissioner Tan for asking me to speak today. I would begin by thanking Michael for his very thoughtful words and warm welcome to country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and talk today. I'm here in Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I would like to pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. As you said, the EU delegation has been a proud partner of the Human Rights Commission as a sponsor of the Racism It Stops With Me Award since 2015 and the Kep Enderby Award since 2020. And we are delighted to sponsor the Kep Enderby Lecture again this year. We are also honored to join a program named after the then Attorney General Kep Enderby, who in 1975 introduced the Racial Discrimination Bill in the House of Representatives. And I am particularly honored to be sharing a platform with current Attorney General, the Honorable Mark Dreyfus, whom I had the pleasure of meeting during the recent visit of European parliamentarians. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can imagine, human rights and tolerance are at the heart of the EU. The EU is based on promoting and protecting human rights, democracy and rule of law, not just within our borders, but worldwide. The principle of equality started with the principle of equal pay between men and women, which was already enshrined in the 1957 Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community. But today, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which came into force in 1209, provides comprehensive protection of rights and freedoms and goes to the heart of what the European Union stands for, a community of values. EU policy enshrined in new law includes promoting the rights of women, children, minorities, and displaced persons, opposing the death penalty, torture, human trafficking, and discrimination, defending civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and prohibiting completely discrimination based on any ground such as sex, race, ethnic origin, language, religion or belief, disability, age, and sexual orientation. And all of this is reflected as well in the inclusion of human rights clauses in all agreements on trade or cooperation that we sign with non-EU countries. Rights and freedoms are not static and naturally change as society changes, also with advances in technology. And to reflect the modern society, new rights we should seek to protect are data protection and guarantee on bioethics. Following the lecture today, there will be a panel discussion on online hate. And I would like to elaborate on the work that the EU is doing in this area. In order to prevent and counter the spread of illegal hate speech online, back in 2016, the EU Commission agreed with Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and YouTube a code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. Progressively, platforms such as Instagram, Snapchat, Dailymotion, Jeux Vidéo, TikTok, LinkedIn, Rakuten, Viber, and Twitch all agreed to the code of conduct. And in June this year, a new strengthened code of practice on disinformation was signed by 34 signatories, including Google, Meta, Microsoft, TikTok, Twitter, and many, many others. But what is of particular importance here is that the 2022 Code of Practice is the result of the work carried out by the signatories. It is for the signatories to decide which commitments they sign up to, and it is their responsibility to ensure they implement these commitments effectively. The Code of Practice on Disinformation is a first of its kind tool through which relevant players in the industry agreed for the first time on self-regulatory standards to fight disinformation. Still, we have to remain vigilant, and this is why the EU has now proposed the Digital Services Act, which creates a comprehensive set of new rules for all digital services, including social media, online marketplaces, and other online platforms, establishing the principle that what is illegal offline should also be illegal online. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU and Australia are proud multicultural societies, but we need to ensure that our democratic institutions remain free from disinformation and, dare I say it, fake news. We know that online disinformation has been used by some states and interests as a weapon against democracy, to weaken trust in democratic institutions, undermine electoral process, fuel division, and even incite violence in our societies. Our resolve to protect human rights is greater than ever in the new world of disinformation and in particular of foreign undue interference. Protecting human rights, therefore, is to defend democracy as well. We need to work hard and work together to ensure that human rights remain a non-negotiable requirement for citizens everywhere and in every facet of their lives. And there is no plan B. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador Designate, thank you very much for your remarks and for your support for these initiatives as well. We'll now introduce Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner. Mr. Chin Tan began his term as the Race Discrimination Commissioner in October of 2018. And before joining the Commission, Commissioner Tan spent 3 years as the Director of Multicultural Engagement at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. His focus at Swinburne as the head of its cultural diversity strategy was to work collaboratively across the university and the wider community to ensure that Swinburne succeeded as an institution of cultural diversity excellence. Commissioner, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hope you can hear me. Thank you for that very, very warm introduction. And thank you again for agreeing to be the moderator for this important event. And we could have asked for a better moderator in you, Jeremy. So thank you again for your long-standing support of the work that we do. Thank you to you, Michael, for your warm welcome to country. I'm grateful to the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge holders who have generously provided input to the work that I have done and been conducting over the last few years. And I acknowledge the long history and leadership of First Nations peoples in anti-racism efforts. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am joining you today from Melbourne, the Bunurong Bung Warang and Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional custodians of the lands from which you're all joining us today, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge their connection to land, waters, and community, and may I also extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. Thank you, Ambassador Vicentine, for today's very warm and very generous and very instructional opening of the event with your very, very insightful remarks. So I'm exceptionally grateful, Ambassador, for the EU's delegation's ongoing and generous support of the Commission's work. Today's lecture honors the legacy of the late Kep Enderby, the Attorney General who introduced the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. I also wish to thank my race discrimination team led by Kath Daft and staff at the Commission for their dedicated work in organizing this year's event and for the success they brought to the Kep Enderby lectures each year. Today, we are honored to be hearing from the Attorney General, the Honorable Mark Dreyfus, KCMP, about the government's commitments in combating racism, including on our First Nations justice, a national anti-racism strategy, and governance on human rights institutions. I'm grateful that we are especially encouraged by the government's commitment to this year's budget to funding the Commission's work in developing a national anti-racism strategy over the course of the next 4 years and beyond. The topic of today's lecture is timely as the Commission endeavors to improve protections against racism at the intersection of other forms of discrimination by developing a national anti-racism framework and to support anti-racism initiatives by relaunching the Racism It Starts With Me campaign. Our work is only achievable with the generous support, input, and advice from the community members, experts, and advocates. Dr. Matteo Vergani, Rita, Jabri, Markwell, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan, who will participate in the panel shortly, are experts on online hate and anti-racism action who have contributed greatly, and I want to thank them, to the initial scoping phase of the National Anti-Racism Framework Project and the broader work of our team. Since March of last year, the Commission has been hearing from people across the nation about what a national response to racism might contain. Today, I'm keen to hear and learn from the Attorney General and our panelists, whose insights and experience will no doubt benefit our further work in developing such a framework. As we listen today, it might be helpful to contextualize these insights with the key findings from the framework's project's initial scoping. Informed by a community-led approach and thanks to the help of many community organizations, the Commission heard from a range of peak and community organizations, experts and service providers, human rights agencies, and governments at all levels on their vision for a framework that will guide anti-racism action by all sectors of society. While acknowledging the limited resources that we have had to date, there is still much work to be done to ensure comprehensive community level input in our work, which is crucial to the work and success of the framework. But at this priority setting level of the initial scoping phase, 6 major themes have emerged consistently across sectors and communities, which provide a solid grounding for the project's continued work. The first theme, and I'll run to that very quickly, the first theme and the leading feedback from all participants, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and those from non-Indigenous backgrounds, is the importance of centering First Nations sovereignty and truth-telling about the historical racism and ongoing impacts of settler colonization on First Nations peoples, and which are necessary foundations for anti-racism in the Australian context. The second theme that we have heard is the need for a robust definition of racism that highlights its systemic nature, reflects a nuanced and intersectional understanding of racism, one that is community-centric, and again, acknowledges First Nations people's rights and history and the ongoing impacts of settler colonizations on our communities. The third theme is the need for effective collection of comprehensive national data on the prevalence and impacts of racism as measures around racial equality and equity, with an emphasis on establishing ethical mechanisms for data collection, management, and reporting in order to guide policy work and community understanding of racism. The fourth theme is prioritizing education in anti-racism efforts to ensure broad-based racial literacy, including by truth-telling about Australia's colonial and migration history in curricula and in workplaces, and facilitating racism awareness and anti-racism training for students, teachers, and employees. The fifth theme is fostering cultural safety in the workplace and in service provision by centering, again, First Nations and diverse communities' interests and rights, taking a strength-based approach to workplaces and clientele diversity and representation, and embedding anti-racism at the institutional level through robust training and accountability mechanisms. The fifth and final theme that we have heard is the need for enhanced visibility and responses at the intersection of different forms of discrimination. And beyond these 6 cross-cutting themes, many participants also raised concerns in 3 policy areas. Firstly, participants called for enforceable and comprehensive legal protections against racism that are reflective of Australia's commitments to international human rights instruments, with emphasis on improving access to reporting mechanisms and offering meaningful redress for hate crimes and incidents. Secondly, participants are concerned with oversight and accountability within the justice system, particularly in relation to the systemic discrimination experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Participants advocated for safe complaints mechanisms, community-led support services for those caught in the criminal justice system, as well as culturally safe and responsive legal assistance. Finally, participants advocated for enhanced regulation of both traditional and digital media, highlighting the potential of media representation and either fostering inclusion or reinforcing the harmful impacts of racial profiling and stereotyping. For those of you interested in learning more about the scoping findings, I encourage you to stay tuned for the release of the interim scoping report. Hopefully it will be towards the end of the month. And I'm very thankful for the critical support, contributions, and visions generously shared by participants, community at large, and by yourself in this initial scoping phase. We've recently announced multi-layered, multi-year government funding for a national anti-racism strategy. The framework project now has the means to continue its important work in a community-led core design approach. Recognizing that First Nation peoples and negatively racialized communities have long led anti-racism action, are therefore best placed to advise on the necessary approaches and strategic outcomes of this work. We anticipate the new funding will enable comprehensive, culturally safe and accessible consultations, and ultimately produce a framework that reflects shared understandings and community-centric strategies and outcomes. I'm certain the insights from today's lectures and panel discussion will equip us to better understand racism and explore anti-racism solutions more effectively as a society. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts, contributions, and visions for a national anti-racism framework and the next phases of the project. And I just want to leave you with a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., who underscores the importance of our personal and collective responsibility and commitment to addressing racism in order to secure a more just and equal society. And he said, human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals, unquote. And so thank you all for sharing and spending time with us this afternoon. Thank you to you, Jeremy.
Commissioner, thank you very, very much for your contribution and also for the work that you're doing in leading this, the work around this issue, addressing racism in Australia, no doubt very complex indeed. Thank you very much. So today's keynote address is by the Attorney General of Australia, the Honourable Mark Dreyfus. And it's an opportunity to learn about the Australian government's vision to advance human rights. Mr. Dreyfus is described as a defender of the rule of law, freedom of the press, and a proponent for a powerful and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission. He's also an advocate for social justice and believes in creating a sustainable economy and environment for future generations. The Attorney General has pre-recorded today's keynote address.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional custodians of the lands from which I deliver this lecture today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would like to thank Commissioner Tan for the invitation to present the Kep Enderby Lecture for 2022. Kep Enderby's career was marked by a commitment to human rights and the law. A lawyer, Commonwealth Attorney General, and later a judge, he made a lasting contribution to Australia's anti-discrimination framework. It was a Labor government that established the foundations of the anti-discrimination framework underpinned by international human rights law. The Albanese government will build on that proud tradition of strengthening anti-discrimination law. The establishment of the anti-discrimination framework as we know it can be traced back to 1948, when Labor Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Herbert Vere-Evatt, also known as Doc Evatt, oversaw the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as President of the United Nations General Assembly. Australia's role in drafting the declaration demonstrated and affirmed our commitment to protecting and promoting human rights, both domestically and abroad. Subsequent Labor governments have built upon this bedrock and shaped the human rights protections we know and enjoy today. In 1975, the Racial Discrimination Act was enacted. This Act protects an individual's right to be free from discrimination on the grounds of race, colour, descent, or national or ethnic origin in any field of public life. The Act fulfils Australia's obligations under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It was the Whitlam government, specifically the Honourable Kep Enderby, in his role as Attorney General, who introduced and ultimately passed the Racial Discrimination Act. In the second reading speech for the Racial Discrimination Act, he stated, and I quote, "The prescribing of racial discrimination in legislative form will require legal sanctions. These will also make people more aware of the evils, the undesirable and unsociable consequences of discrimination, the hurtful consequences of discrimination, and make them more obvious and conspicuous." End quote. The protections in the Racial Discrimination Act to this day provide remedies to victims of racial discrimination and racial hatred. Subsequent Labor governments continued to develop and strengthen Australia's human rights framework with the introduction in 1984 of the Sex Discrimination Act. The Disability Discrimination Act followed shortly thereafter in 1992. These important human rights initiatives by Labor governments have provided protection from discrimination, and equally as important, they have changed attitudes in the community. The Howard government, supported by the Labor opposition, introduced the Age Discrimination Act in 2004. The Australian Human Rights Commission plays a crucial role in educating the public about human rights and the protections enshrined in our law. Our understanding of human rights is continually evolving, and with it, so must our law. The Keating government understood the necessity for human rights law to evolve, and in 1995 introduced the Racial Hatred Act. This important act added to the protections in the Racial Discrimination Act against racial vilification in the form of Section 18C. For almost 30 years, this provision has protected Australians against the poisonous effect of racist hate speech. Over the same period of time, 18C's companion provision, Section 18D, has operated to provide extensive protections for freedom of speech. Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act makes it unlawful to do an act otherwise than in private that is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate people because of their race, colour or national or ethnic origins. The protection in Section 18C has continued to serve Australians well. Despite the important protections provided by Section 18C, the provision has been repeatedly attacked by coalition governments since 2014. As I said, in 2016, Labor will oppose any attempts by this government to water down the legal protections against race hate speech. As Senator Patrick Dodson said in November 2016 during Senate debate on proposed 18C amendments, and I quote, "Words do matter." Labor succeeded in preventing any changes to Section 18C. Australia is home to people who can proudly claim ancestry from our oldest continuous cultures, and people who identify with more than 270 cultures who have come to this land and greatly enriched us all. Combating hate speech helps all Australians feel protected and at home in this country. Unfortunately, as Commissioner Tan has previously noted, there has been a documented resurgence in discriminatory attitudes in our communities. There was a 14% increase in complaints made under the Racial Discrimination Act 1975 prior to the pandemic from 2017 and 2019. During the pandemic, between 2018 and 2021, there was a significant 57% increase in complaints. We continue to hear allegations of race-based misconduct across sporting codes and within workplaces and in other aspects of public life. The government condemns racism without reservation. Like so many Australians, to me, this issue is deeply personal. My father, his brother, and their parents were forced to flee from Nazi Germany for the simple reason that they were Jewish. My great-grandparents could not be convinced to leave. They died in the Holocaust. My family's story, as well as the broader history of the Jewish people, informs my work as Attorney General today. It is a history, personal and cultural, that ensures that I have undying gratitude to this nation and to its generous people for taking in my father, his brother, and my grandparents in their time of desperate need. It is a history that makes me appreciative of the wonderful diversity of this nation and the need to continually protect that diversity. It reinforces the need to uphold and where possible to strengthen the fundamental human rights in which that diversity flourishes. Australia's continued success as a multicultural nation must include an ongoing commitment to addressing racism. The government takes this obligation very seriously. The first step towards bringing our anti-discrimination protections in line with community expectations is to recognise that the integrity of this framework is dependent upon the proper functioning of and support for an independent Australian Human Rights Commission. The Albanese government strongly supports the work of the Commission and appreciates its vital role in Australia's human rights agenda, both internationally and domestically. That is why the government increased the Commission's ongoing funding in the October 2022-23 budget, and we have begun work to restore integrity to the process of appointments. Our commitment is that all future appointments to the Australian Human Rights Commission be made via a merit-based and transparent process that fully complies with the Paris Principles. This isn't just a matter of process. It has serious implications for Australia's international standing on issues of human rights. In March 2022, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions Subcommittee on Accreditation deferred the Commission's re-accreditation until October 2023 on the basis that the selection and appointment process for commissioners did not fully comply with the Paris Principles. Specifically, the subcommittee was concerned about 3 direct appointments that were made to the Commission without going through a selection process. If Australia's National Human Rights Institution is downgraded to B status, it would limit the ability of the Commission to independently engage with international forums such as the UN Human Rights Council, which limits participation to A status institutions. To address the subcommittee's concerns, in July this year, I introduced the Australian Human Rights Commission Legislation Amendment Selection and Appointment Bill into the Parliament. Last week, it passed into law. These amendments will implement a merit-based and publicly advertised process for appointments to the Commission. This is a critical part of this government's agenda to restore integrity to our public institutions, and it was the first legislation I introduced. This will support the Commission's re-accreditation as an A-status national human rights institution, which is essential to its institutional independence, legitimacy, and international credibility. But this is only the start of the Albanese government's human rights reform agenda. There is more that can and must be done. Reconciliation Australia states in its latest State of Reconciliation report that we are at a tipping point and that as a nation we need to move from a space of safe to brave on issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This bravery is needed on all issues relating to racism and inclusion in Australia. The government committed during the last election to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, including recognising First Nations people in the Constitution by enshrining an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. The voice will be an advisory body to Parliament and the government that will have a practical impact for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by giving them a direct say in laws, policies and programs which affect their day-to-day lives. Putting the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in our Constitution is a very important step towards achieving true reconciliation with Indigenous Australians and closing the gap. It sends a clear and unequivocal message of respect for our Indigenous culture and heritage by ensuring our First Nations people are heard and that they are given a direct say in matters that affect them. The government has already begun work on the voice referendum, and we are committed to delivering it in partnership with the Australian community. A successful referendum requires as much support as possible, at the heart of which lies support from First Nations people. We are working in consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the Australian community more broadly in the lead up to the referendum. This engagement with Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians will be broad, it will be based on respect, and it will be focused on building consensus. This is only the beginning of remedying the injustices faced by Indigenous Australians. The Commonwealth Government has committed a record $81.5 million to expanding justice reinvestment initiatives across the country to be designed and delivered in full partnership with First Nations people. This government wants to see fundamental and long-term change in the underlying social factors that contribute to crime and incarceration, and I will continue to champion the resolution of youth justice and detention issues with my state and territory counterparts through the Standing Council of Attorneys General. Importantly, these efforts will build on the Commonwealth's commitments to justice for First Nations people and the achievement of Outcome 11 of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap to reduce the disproportionate rates of detention of First Nations youth. I said in my first speech to the Australian Parliament in 2008, and I quote, "Tolerance lies at the heart of our Australian multiculturalism," end quote. And of course, tolerance can go a long way to preventing division and conflict. With the benefit of time and reflection, I have come to believe that we must do more than tolerating our differences. I feel that it is in the open-hearted acceptance and genuine appreciation of difference, rather than the mere tolerance of it, that the foundations of a truly multicultural and diverse society must rest. From this position, we will not just tolerate people from other cultures and religions, but actively seek to understand, accept, and welcome people. We can also do more than creating a framework for complaints and conciliation of claims of racism or racial hatred. Labor joins the Australian Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, FECA, and other peak bodies in acknowledging that a national anti-racism strategy is sorely needed. The Albanese government announced before the election that it would commit $7.5 million to fund the Australian Human Rights Commission to complete its national anti-racism framework and implement a comprehensive national anti-racism strategy. This commitment was delivered with the funding announced in the budget last month. I want to acknowledge here the role of the Race Discrimination Commissioner and of the staff of the Commission to date on the early stages of a national anti-racism framework and, of course, the recently relaunched Racism It Stops With Me campaign. Your hard work has prepared the groundwork for the next phases. The anti-racism strategy will develop a shared understanding of racial equality to build support for an inclusive national narrative in which the rights of all people are protected and promoted, regardless of race, ethnicity, or cultural background. The strategy will include two major streams of work. Firstly, a national anti-racism framework will be established, intended to support the commitment of government, civil society and business, and the community to tackle racism and promote racial equality in Australia. The second aspect of the strategy is a national public awareness and educative campaign under the existing Racism It Stops With Me banner. The Albanese government is funding Australia's independent and accredited Human Rights Commission to deliver this strategy. We know that the Commission is best placed to deliver a high-impact and wide-reaching anti-racism campaign, leveraging existing tools, experiences and community networks developed through its recent anti-racism work. Racism has a significant economic, social and national impact on Australia, and the government is committed to combating racism and its impacts. We are committed to maintaining the integrity of our anti-discrimination framework and ensuring that it continues to meet the needs of the Australian community today. This is in keeping with the legacy handed down and expanded upon by Australian Labor governments of generations past. We look forward to working alongside you and all of our fellow Australians to author this next essential chapter. Thank you.
Our thanks to the Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus for that address and the analysis of the challenges and complexities, along with the opportunities to address racism. This has been one of the very first public opportunities we've had to hear about the government's commitments on justice for First Nations people and a national anti-racism strategy. We're grateful for the opportunity to hear about the government's commitments on justice and First Nations people, that strategy, and the governance, integrity and transparency of human rights institutions like the Australian Human Rights Commission too. I'm very pleased now to introduce our panellists for a discussion on online hate and what that means for prospective legislative reform. Recent work by the Commission around a national anti-racism framework has identified this as a key area for urgent action. Online spaces are places where the protection and promotion of individual and collective human rights are constantly challenged. Sometimes this breach of rights has serious consequences, including in the physical world. Our panellists are here to share their observations and expertise on online hate and their advocacy for reform too. Dr. Matteo Vergani is an expert on data and online hate at the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies. He's also a member of the Australian Hate Crime Network. Rita Jabri Markwell is a lawyer practicing in fields dealing with the protection and promotion of rights. Among the bodies she's involved with is the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, or AMAN. It's a national body focused on securing the physical and psychological safety of Australian Muslims. Rita leads AMAN's engagement with the tech industry and researchers and its contributions to law and policy reform in Australia. And Professor Sandy O'Sullivan is a Wiradjuri transgender non-binary person, an ARC Future Fellow and Professor of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. Welcome to all of you, and it's great to have you along.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Now, we've got so much to get through. I want to begin with this idea that online spaces can be both a good thing and a bad thing. You know, the vital work takes place online in addressing racism. People form communities, they form relationships with each other, they build momentum for change, and they use it as an opportunity to work together, to learn from each other too. We also know that online communities can be harmful and unsafe. In your experience, Matteo, what are the implications of that online hate?
Thanks, Jeremy, for the introduction, and thank you for the great question. Look, I think the implications of online racism go well beyond digital platforms. So this is a common misconception that we are talking about, hurt feelings, but it's not. There is great and solid research showing that on and offline harms are strongly interconnected. Targets of online hate are often targets of offline violence. And there is a co-occurrence in specific geographical areas at aggregate levels of online hate and offline hate. So we are not just talking about, people talking bad things or saying slurs. It's really about violence and an ecosystem of hate.
Rita, you have done a lot of work in this area, and I want to point particularly to your advocacy around the Christchurch massacre, an event that took place in another country. A lot of it started online, but it had real-world implications for people here. Tell me about how you observed that playing out.
Thank you. So it was very significant because it was an Australian man who carried out that attack. But I'd like to acknowledge that it's not the first time an Australian has carried out a massacre or an atrocity. And the first massacres, obviously, against First Nation peoples which are, you know, throughout our history. And what I can really observe is that all of those atrocities followed a period of dehumanization, dehumanizing a group to portray them as not being part of the human family, as being less deserving of moral protections, of being worthy recipients for disgust, and as if they are somehow polluting or despoiling or debilitating an in-group. And that has very much been the pattern throughout history, not only in Australia, but it is something that we would love to see specifically dealt with in the public sphere, because it's causing a lot of psychological harm and physical danger as well.
Sandy, there is evidence that this sort of sustained discourse, the sustained pressure is felt very distinctly by Indigenous people in Australia, no less in the last couple of weeks. Tell me what your experience of that has been like.
I think it's a bit misleading to say it's just in the last couple of weeks, with all due respect. I think it's been an ongoing issue for us. I'm here on Kabi Kabi land, by the way. And as a Wiradjuri person, as an older Wiradjuri person, one of the sort of key things that I'd say is that we got across the last few years on social media some very good indications of how racism affects and slams First Nations people and the impact that it has outside of social media. But, you know, I just want to use as an example, when the Queen died, there was a lot of hate directed at Indigenous groups and individuals for failing to express sorrow. You know, basically that was the reason. I was running Indigenous X that morning, and I tweeted that Aboriginal people shouldn't have to be magnanimous on the passing of the Queen. There were hundreds of slurs in response. 4 people said I should be put down, using those exact words. 6 said I should be assaulted, not using those exact words. 15 people tweeted my home address. 1,892 people wrote something overtly racist or transphobic, or unsurprisingly both. Many suggested that we were lucky we were colonised by the British because they were kind. Many suggested if we weren't colonised, we wouldn't even have the wheel. This was just public tweets. I also got death threats offline, other threats and racist and transphobic emails via phone and via email. They threatened my work. 85 people questioned whether I should be a professor. But the real concern isn't like this happening to some old person. You know, I'm fine. This is that it's one person that I'm talking about that received this. And what does witnessing that show our kids? You know, what do our kids and grandkids have to hear this? And why is there nothing that can be done about challenging it? And the answer is that there are little things that can be done, but the truth is that they don't actually, they don't work. They don't work as this kind of fundamental reporting structure. And it does require us to take both personal and community responsibility for responding to those bad actors.
Matteo, I want to pick up on that point, because you referred earlier to this idea that things that happen online stay online. To what extent can lower level incidents online, things that haven't spilled over yet into the real world, be a predictor of a more severe action taking place physically in the real world?
This is a great question, Jeremy. There is emerging research in the last few years in London and in Germany showing that we can use certain types of online hatred and expression of hate in certain forums to predict a rise at aggregate level of hate crime incidents, violence against immigrants, violence against, perceived religious and racial minorities. The real issue is that we do not have enough data to make these models, these predictive models, good enough. So, especially in Australia, we are 20 years behind maybe the UK and 30 years behind the US in terms of legislating a need for a consistent data collection of hate speech and hate crimes across all jurisdictions. So this makes predictive models very hard.
Rita, to what extent do we have a repository of hate crimes that are taking place in Australia?
At the moment, we only have really community-led mechanisms, which I know now sort of exist in the Jewish community, the Muslim community, First Nations community, and to an extent, I think the Asian Alliance also does that work. But the main issue is that because we don't have hate crime laws that are effective hate crime laws across Australia and our different states, that makes it very hard to know, what is a hate crime, what is the definition, and that has obvious impacts for data in terms of police not recording things as hate crimes. And it has an effect for both data, for policy, and also for community, because it's a double sense of trauma when a young boy is killed in a hate crime and then no one can acknowledge that it was a hate crime. That's just, it's a double layer of trauma.
Sandy, there is resistance to confronting racism in all areas of public life, including in online spaces. Do you have a sense of why you think that might be the case?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to also challenge really what you just said, Rita. I think there has been an acknowledgement of it. It's not by no one. We've been acknowledging it. Aboriginal people have been acknowledging it, and I think, and promoting it and talking about it. And we punch above our weight in terms of having a voice in online spaces and being knocked down for it. I think the work that people like, Professor Bronwyn Carlson is an example of someone who's done remarkable amount of research work on online hatred. I work with Professor Carlson, and this is based on survey from people who've experienced online violence, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in particular who've been subject to it. And, that often isn't brought up in that broader understanding. It's often seen as Indigenous studies research, and that's very interesting. I'm sorry, but that's actually really crucial to us understanding this, to say we've got this data and people are going, well, that's nice, but how can we move forward? And I'm not, prosecuting the case that you're saying that, but I'm just saying that quite often our agency is missing in this. And what do we do to kind of challenge that? Well, one of the things is, again, making sure that people who are subject to it are part of creating a framework, that this isn't just an idea of what might happen in theory, but it's an idea of what happens in practice. That's why I started with those statistics. That's why I started by talking about me as an individual. I'm one person. This is happening to hundreds of thousands of people in that online space. And what they're choosing to do is to step away from it, to stop being active, to stop making cases. And, and again, there is the flip opposite, that we're often asked to speak for others. And we're often asked to try and take something like the tragic lynching of a child that happened, and turn it into something that is an example, and none of us want to do that. That isn't appropriate. It should just be that this is absolute violence, and absolute violence, wherever it's taking place, needs to be held to account.
Matteo, how clearly defined are hate crimes when you move between states and territories? How is it that we ended up with so many different versions of how things can possibly be defined?
Jeremy, this is great, because I guess at Australian level, the approach to define, tackle, measure hate speech and hate crime, look, it's, let me say, at least piecemeal, fragmented, ineffective, I would say. So we have different understandings when we have them, because we don't have them in every state, of even how to call these incidents. So we have, bias crimes in New South Wales, prejudice motivated crimes and incidents in Victoria. But the thing is that really at a legislative federal level, we do not have a hate crime legislation, which, for example, exists in the United States since 1990, the Hate Crimes Statistics Act, which requires the FBI to collect hate crime data. In our states, our police forces, not even all of them are required to tick the box whether a crime is prejudice motivated or not. So we have no idea. If you ask me, have hate crimes increased over time or not? Well, to be honest, I don't know. No one knows, because we do not collect enough data. And also, to finish, the other problems is not just about data collection, it's about protecting our communities and our citizens. So some groups are more protected than others. It's unclear why. And there is such a, fragmented approach to look at issues in silos. So we're looking at racism, and then Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, as if they were different things, but they aren't. So we need really to keep all of our communities safe.
Sandy, you've been involved in some of the consultation that's been taking place in developing this national framework. I'm interested in your view of how easy it is to bridge those disparities that Matteo was just talking about.
This is terrible, but I have to say I don't know. And I mean, that should be where our starting point for a framework is, to say, let's look at the things that are working. Let's look at, because there are some things that work, some reporting processes work, and let's look at why those other ones aren't. But it's also understanding, I mean, what Matteo was just saying about, obviously the combination of all of these kinds of hate crimes are bleeding into one another. It's why I mentioned, I'm transgender, and the transphobia came along with racism, because of course it did, because that's the colonial project. But that doesn't mean that we can't challenge it. That doesn't mean that we can't challenge that coloniality, and that we can't challenge those views that say that people don't have a right to be in the world. And that's got to be fundamental to any framework that we have. It's got to be that, and that's the approach that we've taken with the Racism That Stops With Me campaign, is to say it stops with me, but it also stops with us as a community. And the only way that we do that is actually to be participants in it, not just go, well, there's not a very good reporting mechanism for Twitter, so that's sad, so maybe stop using it, or, find a way to delete those emails and don't read that bad stuff that people send you. It's not participating. It's actually saying we've got a right to be here, and everybody else needs to find a way to ensure that, that we're there.
Rita, I'm interested in your view on that, about how we bridge that gap between community expectations and where the legislation ultimately lands. You're a strategist, you're a lawyer. I'm interested in your view of how you see those things meeting up eventually.
I want to echo what Professor Sullivan just said in terms of sharing the responsibility and treating this as a public harm as well, because what happens online, we see algorithms and design features all feeding into this problem, and we see information operations which are operating on a serial basis, systematically dehumanizing an out-group to an in-group audience. What are we doing to disrupt those serial bad actors online? And should it be left to the community to be fighting each one of those bad actors, because there's so many of them? And it is the product, the product belongs to Meta, it belongs to Twitter, it belongs to these platforms. They should be keeping it safe. Our laws at the moment, our anti-discrimination laws, don't explicitly connect to those social media companies. And I think that's a very immediate change that the Australian government could make, is to make it clear that our hate speech standards, our discrimination standards apply to them, and they need to be respecting and applying our standards. And in terms of the Online Safety Act, I think we do need to shift to dealing with the dehumanisation of group identities and hatred towards groups as an issue, not just harm directed at individuals, because the harm that's directed at individuals is a downstream consequence of allowing that hatred to run at a communal and a collective level, and for people to be socialized in that as if that's normal, and then they let leash on individuals, and it's not fair. It's not fair to leave the burden on the individual to then withdraw, to remove themselves, to deal with the aftermath, to try and seek justice. We should be acting more upstream to create a safe public sphere where Australians are not consuming misleading material that is, making them feel disgust and rage and fury towards other Australians.
Rita, when you have contact with tech companies, what is their response to those propositions about their capacity and their willingness to tackle some of those issues, and whether it does in fact, the responsibility does in fact fall with them?
Look, I think Meta, for example, has had a position for quite a while that they are pro-regulation, that they want an equal playing field. We've seen comments from the new owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, saying that he's happy to apply the standards of each country as long as they're clear and they apply to his company. In terms of capacity and capability, expertise, resources, that really sits with the platforms. But they do need to have a good contextual understanding of hatred as it applies to different communities, because context is really important. The problem is at the moment is that they are not funding compliance units within Australia because I don't think they think that they need to. It's not clear that our laws apply to them and that they have a duty of care to meet our laws.
Matteo, I'm interested in your view on that, about the capacity of tech companies to actually fall into line and set up these compliance units to make sure that they are operating on a level playing field and that they are taking on the responsibility for protecting the community too.
Yeah, look, I personally, there are many, personal views on these. I personally do not want Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg to decide what is legitimate and not legitimate. At the same time, I think we do not have to trust one single word of what they say. So we need to keep them accountable, and we need to demand transparency in what they do. The harm that their algorithms to use to, for example, create political advertisement and the targeting of micro segments of the community and feeding these segments with racist, populist, political views, was able to change the results of very important elections around the world. And we have no idea how these algorithms work. There is no transparency about that. So we regulate political advertisement, for example, on TV, but we don't do it in social media because they're not transparent about what they do. So we need, first of all, to demand transparency.
Rita, you're nodding your head there, and I wonder if, the thing that pops into my head is this idea that for every algorithm, every AI feature, there is a human hand involved in that too, right?
There is, and there's also the capacity for human review of, if they will agree, if those platforms will agree, of their algorithms, especially the recommender algorithms, which are pushing people down a rabbit hole on particular, theories.
Sandy, can I get your view on this idea that I think all of us have been subject to some degree of online attacks. For me, it happened this morning, and that's not an unusual thing. I'm interested in your view because I sort of sit back sometimes and I think, I don't know who this person is. To what degree is anonymity and the identification and the commodification of verification that Elon Musk has spoken about in the last couple of days valuable in this space in terms of creating legislation? Because it's certainly something that the tech companies talk about, governments around the world talk about.
verification is a bit different to the commodification of verification, obviously. And I guess, verification was incredibly important. There was just a couple of tweets that were happening simultaneously today from people who were famous figures who said that until there was some process of verification, they were incapable of being able to tell people that they were the real person. And as a result, there was really bad acts by other people who had more followers than they did using their name. Look, there are obvious things, and the impact for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with this is that, if you're being targeted as an individual, and people know your name, they will find you. That's one of the risks. So that's the risk of not having anonymity. The risk of having anonymity is obviously that, that you get these bad actors that are able to serially create new accounts, etc., and just come up with the same old, bad racist takes on everything, and and this kind of hate speech proliferates, and they are both competing issues. So I don't mean to give an excuse that the social media companies use, but there are other mechanisms other than just the name that somebody is using. There are other strategies that you can use to manage verification, and there are ways that you can set it up to provide safety, and I'd love to see that within a framework. But I think when Indigenous X was hammered, and I was hammered individually, but Indigenous X had to take off the platform. This is a national Indigenous organisation that provides a massive amount of support and advocacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And they had to remove their account for a period of time after we were hammered in September. And the reason for that was, it was dangerous for other people. It wasn't good to have people seeing that. But, we met with Twitter, and they were very supportive of trying to find solutions, but they didn't really have them. Their solutions were to try some new things, and then there was a bit of a change in leadership, so we're not too sure whether that will go through. But there is a desire there, but they don't know how to do it, and that kept coming through very clearly. And that's absolutely no diss on the people from Twitter who were genuinely concerned and genuinely wanted to do something. But again, when we were sending out messages about racial slurs, they were coming back with reports that went, we're sorry you feel this way, but it doesn't contravene any any rules for the platform, and so sorry, that's it. We know you feel disappointed, and this is racial slurs. This is actually, I got that about 2 death threats. So so that it doesn't align, it doesn't match up, and it's this massive disincentive for people to be engaged in that online space. So.
Can you take us inside that decision about Indigenous X disengaging from online for a while?
In fact, they've just...
It's obviously a really difficult kind of decision that conflicts with what its purpose is in the first place.
Look, it was horrible. We had 16 million impressions of that first tweet. So there were a massive amount of people from around the world that didn't know what Indigenous X was, or in fact, Indigenous people. And so it was getting a lot of hatred, and it was really being trolled in that extensive sense of the word, So it was creating a space where there was so much work that had to be done, but where we thought what was happening was people were bearing witness to massive racism and transphobia in that space, to the extent that Indigenous X was contributing to that. And we just didn't want to do that. And so the decision was made at that stage, not to cease operations of Indigenous X, but to not have the Indigenous X account be taken over as it had for 10 years by a different Indigenous person every week who talks about the experience of what it is to be Indigenous. It's a different person every week, 52 weeks of the year. You had the experiences and and thoughts and concerns and advocacy of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that just disappeared at that point. And the response to it from our supporters, we've got 80,000 people following that account, was horror. You know, and many of those people had come on and done that work to report those accounts, to, you know, to have good comments, you know, to provide support. But it's just an example of where, you know, not having that advocacy. I mean, there would have been times over the last couple of weeks and couple of months where it would have been amazing to have that, where it would have mattered. And in fact, that's just an example of how that the impact of racism causes less participation in online spaces.
I want to get back, Rita, to a point Sandy made a moment ago about finding solutions, what solutions there are. You're involved in this work. I wonder what you see as the priorities for solutions and why they're particularly important at this time.
As I say, I think that the law reform is really important, because law defines how society sees a problem. It also determines who's experiencing the burden, like who has to carry the burden of a problem. And at the moment, the way the law is shaped in Australia, the burden really sits on the community and on individuals' shoulders. I would really like to see that responsibility shifted more to the platforms. I agree that we also need a role for our e-safety commissioner. And you know, Aman has done some work defining dehumanising speech and discourse, which we would like to see as part of a civil penalty for serial actors that do this, and for the platforms that enable them, as to targeting a particularly violent and horrible form of hate speech. There is work that also needs to be done in harmonising our media laws. Our Broadcasting Services Act currently doesn't apply to a lot of online content. So this discussion about protecting the public sphere needs to involve not only the Australian Human Rights Commission, but the Australian Communications Media Authority and e-safety to really define what are the harms very well, so we can have clear standards for platforms and also for those regulators.
And then on that point, on regulation of those principles, how much further does that have to stretch to ensure that these principles are adhered to and that there's a regulatory framework around that too?
So the Online Safety Act already provides quite a good framework, in the sense that it's already working on protection as well as prevention. So it has, you know, what the Safety Commission refers to, safety by design, as this guiding principle, and it has, you know, mandates transparency reports. It has the scope for industry standards, as well as notice and takedown provisions for the e-safety commissioner. So as a piece of architecture, it already sort of it has a good neutral framework for us to work with. The problem is that until now, well, right now, we don't have online hatred against groups, you know, or dehumanisation of groups within that framework, and that's what's letting us down.
Matteo, I'm interested in your priorities for solutions that can be tackled easily, and which ones you think are important and why now?
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, first of all, I agree with Rita. We need, you know, a consistent and good legislative framework. But I think also we need, from a, you know, grassroots perspective as well, to stop working in silos. And, you know, anti-racism, homophobia, you know, transphobia, ableism. But we need really to start adopting a holistic approach to the problem. If I may, I'd like to share that I've just published with a team of co-authors a new report proposing a list of bias indicators for the Australian context. So you can find the report in the homepage of the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies website. So the report proposes lists, long, you know, number of lists to understand how to identify the bias motivation behind criminal and non-criminal acts, which, target perceived racial, religious groups, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, women, and then we look at ableism, ageism. So if we are able to start changing a little bit the culture from the grassroots as well, and start thinking that we are all together in this, and we need to improve, learn from each other, improve the support for target communities and individuals, and then, start recording incidents in a consistent way and step up our advocacy, that I think can help maybe create that top-down change, that changes legislation, which we urgently need in Australia.
Your research also spans similar sort of work going on overseas. To what degree are overseas principles and measures transposable directly into Australia?
Look, there are many different examples of approaches. So, for example, in our view, the approach taken in the UK could be applicable to the Australian context. So, for example, in the UK, police records both criminal and non-criminal incidents based not necessarily, as in the United States, on facts or hard evidence, which is not really always easy to provide and demonstrate by witnesses or victims, but they collect data based on perceptions of bias motivation by a witness or a victim, which means, for example, that we can use the reports in different ways. Of course, some go into the criminal justice systems, some don't, and contribute to understanding, education, awareness about what happens in the community. But probably the model adopted in the UK would be, in our view, the most applicable one.
Sandy, can I come to you on this question about your favoured solutions?
I think I just wanted to sort of address one of the things that you just said, Matteo. I think some members of the community will feel more or less comfortable about going to the police. And I think that has to be recognised as a barrier as well. I wouldn't be going to the police myself in the first instance. And I think a lot of other people would feel the same way. So I think there has to be a kind of complex discussion about this as well. Look, I'm doing this work at the moment with Media Diversity Australia, looking at journalists and media professionals who've been subject to online harassment and abuse. And these are very public figures, so it's very interesting to kind of hear what happens for people who are putting themselves out there in the way that journalists and media professionals have to. And, and we're seeking to survey them. And we're doing that for a reason. Like, I don't think we know what the experiences are and the complexity of the experiences until we hear from people. And until we're able to turn that into data, and until we're able to turn that into some meaningful patterns that can actually change how a framework is specific to this continent for a start, but also how it's specific to, it matters that this is professionals working in a space. People who really can't make the choice to not be there. They have to be there. And so their choice is to leave a profession. Well, this is true for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Like, we can't not be there. Like, we're there. And to not be in these spaces is also a way for us not to connect with one another. And so the impact of it is enormous. It is dire. And so whatever we do, we've got to make it a safe enough place for people to participate and to know that there's mechanisms that will be carried through, and not by putting the onus on us to be doing this kind of massive reporting.
It really struck me in reading some of the writings that each of you has published that there's a real opportunity, I think, for more data collection, to make these frameworks based on science and real numbers, and not just a perception of what someone else might be enduring, right, Matteo? I mean, I know a lot of your work is sort of, you know, kind of establishing the questions that we don't have the answers to yet.
Absolutely. And look, perceptions are very important. You're right. I mean, we need numbers, we need hard evidence, but we need also understanding of the nuances, the experiences, the perceptions of people. And we need to combine all these to understand how to protect and create, you know, a better and safer and more just environment for everyone, really.
Now, I want to kind of finish up with a question to each of you about something that we began this session with, this idea of establishing resilience. And, you know, the Commission, I know with my work with them, my private discussions with them, they're all very grateful for the work that people like you do, because you kind of get up in the morning, you keep fighting the fight, even though you might have the wind knocked out of you from day to day. Rita, I'm interested in where you find the get up and go to keep engaging in this space when it can sometimes be disheartening.
Thank you. Look, it really comes from my faith as a Muslim. That gives me so much strength. But you know, it is hard as an advocate from a community, because you have the dual. You're sort of engaging at that intellectual level and the harm prevention level, but you're also experiencing trauma all the time at the community level. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had, you know, a very violent death threat on a local mosque. Someone who's, you know, wants to be the next Brenton Tarrant, you know, in his comments. And that stuff just brings back all the trauma immediately. In terms of being able to, how do we just keep going? I'd really ask the Australian government to consider how can they help now to reduce those constant barrages on our resilience. Because, you know, community resilience does wear thin sometimes because of laws and political speech and media and things which we can actually address in this term.
Matteo, what about you? About where your motivations come from?
Look, I guess they come from, you know, the community I live in. I mean, communities are strong and powerful, and you're right, Rita. I mean, there is a limit to test, you know, how much resilience we have, because I am part of the community too. But I really believe we have, as a community, and myself as a community member, a really big role to play in making our society better, and that's, I guess, our contribution.
Sandy, what about you? Where you find your motivations, your resilience from, particularly when times get tough?
Oh, look, it's from community. And, you know, as a Wiradjuri person, we've got this ethos, which is Yindamara Wanangana, which is very loosely translated as the wisdom of respectfully knowing how to live well, but in a world that's worth living in. So it's about making that world, you know? So it's not just have a good time. It's that we have a responsibility to make this world. And I mean, I'm in my late 50s, you know, I'm not going to live for a long life. Why not do everything? But this is a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are just going, what have we got to lose? Like, but of course, then we don't want this, you know, this violence that's ongoing. And so having strategies, having connected means, listening to people who are even joking around about it, and, you know, finding a way to kind of navigate that is an important part of it. And I think, you know, Professor Chelsea Wattago's Another Day in the Colony is a really good line, but more than that, a good ethos to go, well, this is part of the problems with being in a colony, but it doesn't mean that we give up with it, you know, and it doesn't mean that we just accept it. It means that we challenge it.
That is such an uplifting note to finish on, Sandy. Thank you very much, Matteo and Rita as well. Sincerely, thank you all so much for your work, your ongoing work, and also being part of this Kep Enderby Memorial Lecture. Our thanks to the Attorney General, the Honourable Mark Dreyfus, for his address. Now, a recording of this lecture will be uploaded to the Commission's YouTube channel and available to watch in the coming days. It's also worth noting, as we've heard, that the Commission will soon be releasing the interim scoping report on a national anti-racism framework to try to bridge some of those gaps that we've just been hearing about. Today's panel topic and other priority issues for progressing anti-racism efforts in Australia, identified through initial consultations and submissions, will also be outlined and the solutions proposed. And finally, the Commission would like to invite you to attend its upcoming Human Rights Awards ceremony, December 9th, I think, if right off the top of my head. The awards are a warm and uplifting acknowledgement and celebration of the important work that so many individuals and organisations do to advance human rights in Australia. You can join in person in Sydney, and if you're not able to, the event will also be live streamed. All the details for the Human Rights Awards are on the Australian Human Rights Commission's website, so check it out there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Have a blessed day.